Picture the iconic Viking, tall, blonde, pure-blooded Norse raiders from the icy north. But the world's largest DNA survey has upended everything we thought we knew. The bones of 442 Vikings reveal a tangled ancestry. Southern Europeans, steppe nomads, even local Britons, all buried as warriors. If being a Viking was never about blood, how did the myth survive this long? And what does the data truly prove? The answers begin where science drills into the past, and history gets rewritten. Across windswept coastlines and icy hinterlands, archaeologists and geneticists set out on an unprecedented quest. Their goal was to recover the genetic code of the Viking Age, not from a single grave or a handful of bones, but from hundreds of individuals scattered across the former edges of the Norse world. Over 6 years, teams drilled into the dense petrous bones and teeth of 442 skeletons, drawing samples from more than 80 archaeological sites. These sites stretched from the windswept shores of Greenland to the forests of Sweden, from trading hubs in Denmark to far-flung settlements in the British Isles and the Baltic. The remains included men and women, warriors and farmers, children and elders, each one a silent witness to a world in flux. The scale of the project was staggering. Every skeleton was carefully catalogued, its context recorded. A ship burial in Estonia, a mass grave in Dorset, a chieftain's tomb in Denmark, an isolated farmstead in Norway. Each sample underwent painstaking extraction in ultra-clean labs, where ancient DNA was coaxed from fragile fragments, then sequenced base by base. The result was a genetic map spanning nearly 4 millennia, from 2400 BC to 1600 AD, capturing the rise and fall of Viking culture and the peoples who claimed its name. At the center of this scientific odyssey stood Professor Esker Willerslev, whose team coordinated a global network of researchers, museums, and local archaeologists. Their collaboration overcame lost records, degraded samples, and the challenge of tracing ancestry through centuries of migration, conquest, and assimilation. The inclusion of Greenlandic burials, for instance, pushed the boundaries of the Viking world further than ever before, revealing connections that would have been unimaginable just a generation ago. The data did not just track the movement of armies or the spread of artifacts. It illuminated the lives of real people, siblings buried together in Estonia, entire raiding parties laid to rest in England, and individuals whose ancestry could be traced to lands far beyond Scandinavia. With every genome sequenced, the project built a foundation strong enough to challenge legends and rewrite the story of who the Vikings really were. The evidence was now too broad, too detailed, and too human to ignore. The word Viking carries a weighty legend, but its roots are unexpectedly practical. In the earliest sagas and chronicles, Vikinger was never a label for a people or a bloodline. It simply described someone who went raiding by sea, a job, a phase of life, sometimes a desperate gamble for fortune. The phrase "fara I Viking" meant to set out on an expedition, not to claim a birthright. In Old English, the term Wising appears in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, used for those who attacked from the sea, but never as a synonym for all Scandinavians. The original meaning had more in common with a modern job title than with an ethnic group. To go Viking was a choice, not a destiny. Medieval sources are clear. The runestones and sagas speak of Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, Gotlanders, distinct peoples with their own lands and loyalties. Nowhere do they call themselves Vikings. Outsiders, especially monks and chroniclers in England and Ireland, began to use the term as shorthand for the threat from the north, but even then, it described a way of life, not a tribe. The word itself likely draws from Vik, meaning bay or inlet, the places where ships gathered before launching raids. To be a Viking was to be part of a crew, to take part in an expedition, to risk life and limb for plunder, trade, or glory. It was not a birth certificate, it was an occupation. This distinction matters. Archaeologists have long used grave goods, swords, shields, ships, and jewelry to label a burial as Viking. But the new DNA evidence warns against such shortcuts. Some of those buried with the full splendor of a Viking chieftain were genetically local to Scotland, Ireland, or the Baltic. Others in Scandinavia carried ancestry from southern Europe, the Eurasian steppe, or even Sami reindeer herders. The burial customs tell a story of cultural adoption, not just of conquest or migration. Joining a Viking crew, adopting their rights, or earning the right to a warrior's grave could be achieved by outsiders as well as by those born in the north. The DNA and adoption of rights often moved faster than peoples. The language of the time, the objects in the earth, and now the DNA all point in the same direction. Viking was a job description, a shared culture, a network that spanned seas and crossed borders. The myth of a single pure Viking race dissolves when held up to the light of both words and bones. What unites the people we call Vikings is not blood, but the willingness to take to the sea and claim a place in a restless, dangerous world. Beneath the surface of Viking legend lies a genetic patchwork far older and more complex than any saga. The DNA sequenced from those 442 ancient skeletons reveals 3 deep ancestral threads woven through the Viking Age: European hunter-gatherers, Anatolian farmers, and Bronze Age steppe herders. Each of these groups left a distinct imprint, layered over centuries of migration and mixing. The earliest root reaches back to the Stone Age hunter-gatherers who roamed the forests and coasts of northern Europe, thousands of years before the first longship set sail. Their genetic signatures, marked by certain haplotypes and mitochondrial lineages, persist in the genomes of Viking Age Scandinavians. This ancient foundation was joined, starting around 6,000 years ago, by waves of early farmers who migrated north from Anatolia. These farmers brought not only new crops and ways of life, but also a fresh genetic legacy, visible in DNA segments that trace back to the Near East. Then, in the 3rd millennium BC, another group arrived, herders from the Eurasian steppe. Their ancestors had mastered horses and wheeled vehicles, and their genes, especially those linked to lactose tolerance and certain Y chromosome lineages, spread rapidly across Europe. By the time the first Viking raiders sailed out of Scandinavia, these 3 ancestral sources had already blended into a complex mosaic. But the story does not end there. Analysis of the Viking genomes uncovers additional layers. Gene flow from southern Europe, the Baltic, and even the British Isles appears in many individuals. Some skeletons show clear markers of Sami ancestry, hinting at contact and intermarriage with indigenous reindeer herders of the far north. Others carry traces of migration from the east, likely linked to the movement of peoples across the Eurasian steppe. No single genetic profile defines a Viking. Instead, the DNA paints a picture of constant movement, contact, and exchange. A population shaped by centuries of arrivals, departures, and alliances. The result is not a pure Scandinavian lineage, but a living record of Europe's crossroads, inscribed in the bones of those who called themselves raiders, traders, and explorers. This is not a story of simple origins. It is a story of networks, ships, and willingness to absorb outsiders. It is a story that rewrites the old image of a uniform, blonde Viking and replaces it with a far richer, more diverse human history. The classic image of the Viking, a towering blonde giant, blue-eyed and unmistakably Nordic, has been etched into popular imagination for generations. Yet, when scientists began decoding the DNA of Viking Age skeletons, a different picture started to appear. The genetic markers most strongly associated with light hair and eyes, such as SLC24A5 and SLC45A2, were present, but not as dominant as expected. In fact, many individuals carried variants linked to brown hair and darker pigmentation. The numbers tell the story. Among the 442 ancient genomes analyzed, brown hair was common. The frequency of the genetic variants for blonde hair was lower than what is found in modern Scandinavians. Today, populations in Sweden and Norway are, on average, lighter haired than the Vikings themselves ever were. This runs directly against the stereotype crafted by 19th century painters and nationalist writers who imagined the Norse as a race apart, pure, pale, and uniform. Geneticists can now reconstruct likely hair and eye color from ancient DNA, cross-checking the key pigmentation genes with modern reference panels. The results are clear. Viking Age Scandinavia was home to a spectrum of appearances. Some individuals, especially in cosmopolitan trading centers and along migration routes, had the same genetic markers for dark hair seen in southern Europe or the British Isles. Others, even those buried with swords and ships, would not have matched the Hollywood vision of a blonde warrior. This diversity was not random. It reflected centuries of migration, mixing, and movement. The Viking world was open to outsiders, whether through trade, war, or alliance. Each new arrival left a mark in the gene pool, and those marks are visible in the faces reconstructed from the bones. The myth of the uniform, blonde Viking, dissolves under the microscope, replaced by a reality as complex as the history itself. The evidence in their DNA makes it impossible to claim that the Vikings were a people defined by a single look or a single origin. Instead, their story is written in shades of brown and blonde, in genes carried from distant shores. In the centuries before the Viking Age thundered onto the world stage, Scandinavia was anything but isolated. Ancient DNA now reveals a hidden prelude, a series of migrations that carried new people and new genes into the Nordic heartlands between 500 AD and 800 AD. These incoming waves reshaped the population long before the first longships appeared on distant shores. The genetic timeline is mapped out in the bones. Using advanced admixture dating tools, scientists have traced two major surges of ancestry into Scandinavia during this window. The first came from the south, as people with roots in Central and Southern Europe moved north through what is now Denmark. Their DNA, already a blend of Neolithic farmers and Bronze Age herders, left a clear imprint on coastal Danish populations. By the time of the earliest Viking graves, up to a quarter of the ancestry in some Danish sites could be traced to these southern newcomers, with admixture dates clustering from 600 AD to 800 AD, give or take a century. A second influx arrived from the east. Genetic markers linked to the Eurasian steppe and the Baltic traveled through Sweden, especially across the islands of Gotland and Åland. These were not just distant echoes of ancient migrations. The DNA shows recent admixture events, with steppe and Baltic ancestry appearing in Viking Age skeletons from Swedish and island sites. In some individuals, up to 20% of their genome carried these eastern signatures, dating back to the centuries just before the Viking Age. Even the far north was not immune. Some burials in Norway and Sweden reveal a blend of European and Sami ancestry, showing that indigenous reindeer herders and farming newcomers were already mixing by the early medieval period. Meanwhile, trade and contact with the British Isles brought another trickle of genetic diversity into the Scandinavian pool, especially in Western Norway. These findings upend the old picture of a closed, unchanging Nordic population. Instead, the archaeological and genetic evidence points to a region in flux, a crossroads shaped by constant arrivals from south, east, and west. The very people who would later take up the Viking name were themselves the product of centuries of movement and mixing. By 800 AD, the genetic landscape of Scandinavia was already transformed, setting the stage for the outward journeys that would soon follow. Patterns in ancient DNA reveal three distinct paths radiating outward from Scandinavia during the Viking Age. Each path aligns with a core regional cluster: Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish, mapped through principal component analysis and admixture modeling. The Danish cluster, anchored in Jutland and Zealand, shows its strongest genetic links to England. This connection matches the historical record. Danish-led armies established the Danelaw and left their mark on English place names, law, and even the English genome. The Norwegian cluster stretches from the western fjords to the Atlantic, its genetic signature prominent in Ireland, Iceland, and as far as Greenland. Norwegian Vikings sailed west, founding new settlements and carrying their distinct ancestry across the North Atlantic. Meanwhile, the Swedish cluster dominates the eastern routes. Genomes from upland and the Malaran Valley closely match those found along the Baltic, down the rivers of Russia, and into Ukraine. Swedish groups became the Varangians, traders and mercenaries whose journeys reached Byzantium and the Caspian Sea. Despite shared burial customs and material culture, these three clusters remain surprisingly distinct. Genetic analyses show limited mixing between Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish groups, even as they participated in the same wider networks. The boundaries were not absolute, but the DNA makes clear that most individuals who set out from Denmark ended up in England, those from Norway in the Atlantic world, and those from Sweden along the eastern trade routes. This pattern is visible in both the genomes and the geography of Viking expansion. The map of ancient DNA traces not just a single migration, but three separate arcs rooted in different homelands, each leaving its own genetic legacy across Europe and beyond. A shallow pit on Ridgeway Hill in Dorset revealed a scene straight out of a nightmare. Nearly 50 headless skeletons, limbs tangled, skulls heaped in a separate pile. The bones belonged to young men, most in their 20s and 30s, all executed with swift, practiced blows. Archaeologists were certain they had found the aftermath of a mass execution, likely Viking raiders caught and punished far from home. But the story hidden in their DNA would turn out to be even more striking than the violence of their deaths. Forensic teams extracted genetic material from teeth and from dense petrous bones, then compared the sequences to modern and ancient reference panels. The results revealed that 5 of the dead were close relatives, brothers or cousins, bound by blood as well as by fate. Isotope analysis of their teeth traced their childhoods to Scandinavia, with subtle differences hinting at origins across Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. Some had grown up inland, others near the sea, but their paths converged on English soil, far from their homes. The evidence suggests these men set out together, not as a random band of strangers, but as a family unit, kin recruited into the same raiding party, facing the risks and rewards of Viking life side by side. Their presence in the grave transforms the statistics of Viking violence into a human tragedy. Sons and brothers, perhaps even fathers, who died together in a foreign land. The Ridgeway Hill mass grave stands as stark proof that Viking raids could be a family affair, and that the bonds of kinship shape the reality of war as much as any saga or legend. On a quiet stretch of the Estonian coast, archaeologists uncovered a ship burial that rewrote the meaning of kinship in the Viking world. Inside the wooden hull, 4 brothers lay side by side, their bodies arranged with care, surrounded by weapons, shields, and grave goods. The DNA from their bones confirmed what the grave's intimacy suggested. These men were siblings, likely killed in the same battle and sent together into the afterlife. Their genetic profiles traced back to a small community in Sweden, hinting at a family whose fate was shaped by the call of the sea. This burial stands apart from the mass graves of strangers or the solitary tombs of chieftains. Here, the ties of blood were as important as the bonds of crew. Genomic analysis revealed not only the brotherhood, but also the close genetic similarity of the rest of the boat's occupants. Cousins, neighbors, perhaps childhood friends. They were not a random band of adventurers, but a tightly woven group, bound by shared ancestry and shared risk. The ship itself was more than a vessel. It was a floating symbol of family and belonging. To be buried together in such a way was a rare honor, a sign that these brothers had faced the dangers of Viking life not as individuals, but as a unit. Their story, preserved in both bone and soil, gives a human face to the saga of the Vikings, a reminder that, behind the legends of conquest, were families who lived and died together. In this boat, kinship was destiny, and the journey to Valhalla began at home. On the windswept Orkney Islands, archaeologists uncovered graves that looked, at first glance, like the resting places of classic Viking warriors. Swords, shields, and jewelry lay arranged in the soil, echoing the burial rites seen across Scandinavia. Yet when researchers sequenced DNA from these skeletons, the results upended every expectation. The men buried with full Viking regalia were not genetically Scandinavian. Their genomes matched those of local populations, closely resembling present-day Irish and Scottish people, not Norwegians or Danes. In fact, some of the earliest Pictish genomes ever studied came from these so-called Viking graves. This was not an isolated case. Across Orkney and northern Scotland, individuals with no Scandinavian ancestry at all were laid to rest as Vikings, complete with weapons and grave goods. The genetic evidence showed they were local, their roots stretching back through centuries of island ancestry. Yet in death, they were honored with the rights of a foreign seafaring culture. The meaning is unmistakable. In Orkney, becoming a Viking was not a matter of blood, but of choice and circumstance. Local men could join raiding crews, adopt new customs, and earn the right to a warrior's burial, without ever mixing their genes with those from across the North Sea. The culture of the Viking Age was open to outsiders, and its identity could be claimed by anyone willing to embrace its risks and rewards. The bones from these graves tell a story that artifacts alone cannot. That Viking was a role, a reputation, an identity forged on the edge of the known world, and not the inheritance of a single people. In the heart of Scandinavia, the genetic story is anything but uniform. Hubs like Denmark, Gotland, and Åland stand out as crossroads, their ancient cemeteries filled with skeletons carrying a remarkable range of haplotypes. In these places, DNA reveals a level of diversity that rivals the great trading cities of the medieval world. The genetic signatures found here include markers from southern Europe, the Baltic, the Eurasian steppe, and the British Isles, a living record of migration, commerce, and cultural exchange. These hotspots were not isolated outposts, but vibrant centers where people, goods, and ideas mixed freely. The social landscape within Scandinavia was just as complex. Elite burials, those marked by ships, weapons, or rich grave goods, often contain individuals whose genomes show a blend of distant ancestries. Archaeogeneticists measure this through haplotype richness, finding that the most cosmopolitan DNA clusters in the graves of seafaring leaders and traders. Meanwhile, the bones of inland farmers and rural communities reveal a different pattern: more local ancestry, less admixture, and fewer rare haplotype links to far-off lands. The seafaring elite were a mobile minority, their genetic footprints stretching across continents, while the majority of the population remained rooted in the same valleys and forests for generations. In Iceland, the story takes a dramatic turn. Ancient DNA from early graves shows that while most of the men traced their paternal lines back to Norway, the majority of women carried mitochondrial DNA from Gaelic regions, modern-day Ireland, and Scotland. Estimates suggest that up to 80% of Iceland's founding female population had Gaelic roots, a pattern mirrored in Norse settlements across Ireland. This sex-specific ancestry hints at the realities of migration, alliance, and sometimes forced movement, weaving the genetic fabric of new societies from distant threads. Further north, the genetic legacy of the Sami is woven into the Viking tapestry. Some Viking Age individuals, especially in Norway and Sweden, show clear evidence of Sami ancestry, an indigenous heritage that predates the arrival of farming and persists in the genomes of people buried with full Viking honors. These findings upend old ideas of strict boundaries between Norse and Sami worlds. Instead, the evidence points to a society where cultural adoption and genetic blending went hand in hand, and where the lines between insider and outsider were drawn, erased, and redrawn with each new generation. Unlocking the secrets of Viking ancestry required more than shovels and brushes. In sterile laboratories, scientists turned to the petroeus part of the temporal bone, one of the densest bones in the human body and the richest known source of ancient DNA. Each sample, no bigger than a fingernail, was handled with gloves and filtered air to prevent contamination from modern skin cells or airborne particles. The team worked under strict protocols, using negative controls and sequencing blanks to confirm that every genetic signal came from the ancient skeleton, not from the researchers themselves. Extracted DNA was often damaged, fragmented by centuries in the ground. To reconstruct complete genomes, researchers used high-throughput sequencing, reading millions of short fragments and piecing them together like a massive jigsaw puzzle. Most ancient samples yielded low-coverage genomes, just enough data to reveal ancestry, but not every genetic detail. To make sense of this patchwork, scientists relied on advanced population genetics tools. Principal Component Analysis, PCA, allowed them to plot each Viking on a genetic map, showing how close or distant they were from modern and ancient populations. QPDM modeling helped estimate the mixture of ancestral sources in each genome, while ChromoPainter tracked long stretches of shared DNA, revealing recent connections and hidden family ties. Every step was checked and rechecked. Mitochondrial and Y chromosome contamination rates were calculated for each sample. Only sequences passing strict thresholds made it into the final analysis. The team compared ancient sequences to thousands of modern genomes, building a reference panel that spanned Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. This meticulous approach ensured that the patterns uncovered, waves of migration, unexpected kinship, and the blending of cultures, rested on solid scientific ground. The result was a dataset robust enough to challenge centuries of myth and speculation, and to illuminate the true complexity of Viking origins with unprecedented clarity. By the late 1800s, the image of the Viking took on a new life, far removed from its medieval reality. Across Scandinavia and much of Europe, artists, writers, and political leaders began to recast the Norse past as a story of racial destiny. Painters filled canvases with blond, muscle-bound warriors, their hair golden under the northern sun, their eyes as pale as Arctic ice. Opera stages echoed with Wagner's Valkyries, helmeted and fair, while schoolbooks taught children that their ancestors were a pure-blooded Nordic race, superior, untainted, and set apart from the rest of Europe. This reinvention was no accident. In the age of nationalism, countries sought heroic origins to justify modern ambitions. Viking imagery became a tool, wielded by politicians and scholars alike, to promote ideas of ethnic unity and strength. Museums displayed reconstructed skulls and swords as evidence of a noble, ancient lineage. Even the now iconic horned helmet, never worn in battle, was dreamed up by costume designers and romantic painters, not by any Viking craftsman. As the 20th century dawned, these myths hardened. Eugenicists pointed to the imagined Viking as proof of a superior northern race, feeding ideologies that would cast a long shadow over Europe. The myth of the blond, pure Viking was so powerful that it crowded out the messy, multicultural realities of the past, shaping not only popular culture, but national identity for generations. The genetic evidence is now impossible to ignore. The idea of a single, pure Viking bloodline collapses under the weight of hundreds of sequenced genomes. Instead, the bones tell a story of constant movement, connection, and change. The people who sailed, traded, and raided under the banner of the Viking Age carried ancestry from across Europe and beyond. Hunter-gatherers from ancient forests, Anatolian farmers who brought new crops and customs, horse-riding herders from the steppe, and newcomers from southern Europe, the Baltic, and the British Isles. Their descendants mixed and mingled in the trading towns and burial fields of Denmark, Gotland, and Åland, places where the genetic record shows as much diversity as any medieval city on the continent. What made someone a Viking was not a set of genes, but a willingness to join a crew, to cross borders, and to adopt new ways of life. The networks they built, of family, of trade, of shared risk, became their true strength. The DNA from Orkney to Estonia, from Greenland to Sweden, proves that Viking identity was a culture, a profession, a choice. Professor Esker Willerslev, who led the largest study of its kind, put it simply: there is no single Viking gene. The power of the Vikings came from their ability to connect, absorb, and adapt. The real legacy of the Vikings is not purity, but hybridity, a world where ancestry and culture flowed in every direction, and where the only constant was change. Today, millions seek Viking ancestry through commercial DNA kits, yet the science proves there is no singular Viking bloodline to claim. As ancient DNA continues to dismantle myths, identity itself becomes a story of migration, adoption, and reinvention. The real power of the Viking legacy is not purity, but possibility. In a world searching for roots, it is the willingness to embrace complexity that most shapes who we become.